All right. I want to welcome everybody tonight to the Sunday edition of Noisy Reality, Morning Reality. We're talking today again to Professor Jane Kirtley, who is the SILHA Professor of Media Ethics and Law. She is director of the SILHA Center for the Study of Media and Ethics and Law at the University of Minnesota. She is an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and has held visiting professorships at Suffolk University and Notre Dame law schools. She was a Fulbright scholar in the Baltic states, in specifically Latvia, in 2016, teaching media law and ethics. She's written a friend of the court briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court. She has written two books, one titled Privacy Rights in the Digital Age and Media Ethics Today, Issues, Analysis, and Solutions. She's contributed, to many articles over the years in scholarly journals and in the professional and popular press. And importantly, from our point of view, she served as the executive director of the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press for 14 years. Before that, she had practiced law in New York, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. She has been a Pulitzer Prize juror and is a longtime member of the board of the Sigma Delta Chi Foundation. She is, for our perspective, someone who is living in Minnesota right now, living in Minneapolis in particular. So we're very happy to have her come and talk about this terrible situation there. Thank you, Jane, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, just tell us what your impressions are of where we're at right now, this week, today, with everything in Minneapolis. What does it signify to the nation? What are you seeing? How are you sensing? What's happening with this terrible situation that your city's going through?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that I think increasingly we're feeling as if we are ground zero in terms of the Trump administration's war on, I would say the United States, maybe that's too expansive, but certainly against states and municipalities that are not following the line of what his administration would like to have happen. Um, the shooting of Ms. Good was, of course, absolutely horrifying, but it's important, I think, for everybody to know, if they don't realize this, that we've been dealing with ICE here in the Twin Cities for quite some time. And I think what is also worth knowing is that although their activities are visible, to a great extent here in the Twin Cities, they're by no means limited to the Twin Cities. They've been operating from the northern border to all the way down to Rochester, Minnesota. So it's almost the length of the state of Minnesota. And I think there was some national reporting about the fact that ICE went into a smaller town called Wilmore, had lunch at a Mexican restaurant, and then came back afterwards and took away the owner and his wife and others who were employed at the restaurant. The record does not reflect whether they paid their bill or not. I don't know what to say. We had an interesting situation here on Saturday when influencer and convicted January 6th rioter Jack Lang tried to have a parade and demonstration downtown in Minneapolis at our city hall, just outside it. The reports were that about a dozen people showed up to support him. There were several hundred people there that were counter demonstrating. Um, Jacob Fry, of course, our mayor and the governor of the state had called for peaceful demonstration, but there were some altercations. It's not entirely clear who started it or who didn't start it. But what did happen was that he was basically chased down the street and took refuge in a hotel, and that was the end of the big demonstration. There had been a lot of concern that they were going to be trying to engage with the Somali community, many of whom live in an area of Minneapolis. It's called Cedar Riverside, and it's not a very long walk from downtown. And the plan had been, I think, that they were going to go down there and perhaps cause some trouble, but they never got that far because of the reaction from the counter protesters. Um, I can tell you that I teach at the University of Minnesota, as you say, and right now our classes for the spring semester began on Tuesday, the day after Martin Luther King Day, and the university is already basically trying to figure out how they're going to have classes. We have been told to conduct our classes in the modality that they were originally intended to be, meaning if it's in person, you're supposed to do it in person. If it's online, you're supposed to do it online. But they've set up a system where students can ask for basically a variance so that they do not have to physically come to campus. And it's like COVID all over again in terms of trying to figure out how we're going to conduct classes and how we're going to ensure that our students are safe, but also that things at the university go on as they have a right to expect. And so it's difficult, I guess I would say. I mean, that's my little microcosm. We're seeing a lot of people, community groups, and others that are banding together to help those who are I won't even say undocumented because you don't have to be in ICE's crosshairs. It's anybody basically who ICE is identifying and who are afraid to come out, are afraid to go to work, afraid to leave their homes, afraid to send their children to school. So people are bringing them food and supplies and things like that. I was interested to see an interview with one of our local kind of jack of all trade experts who teaches at Hamline University, and he said, you know, that it's not illegal to provide that kind of support to these individuals. I'm not sure ICE or Kristi Noem would necessarily agree with that. You know, clearly you aren't allowed to obstruct, but you know, is helping someone in that way obstruction? Um, I think a dictionary definition would say no, but given the breadth with which this administration is interpreting any kind of activity that doesn't support them, I wouldn't be 100% sure of that. You may have heard that when Kristi Noem was on, I think it was CBS Morning News, I'm not sure which one it was, but one of the morning talk shows, Face the Nation, something like that. She has apparently asked our mayor to create a First Amendment zone where people are allowed to speak and no place else. And he has just flat out rejected that. Of course, it's absurd. But it, I think, is, to me at least, indicative of the fact that the reaction here perhaps is not playing even among Trump supporters in the way the administration had hoped. I think people can see and hear with their own eyes and ears what's going on here.
Well, there's so much to ask you about Minneapolis. Well, let's start with that. Um, what is obviously Minneapolis, Twin Cities has a reputation as a liberal city. And then you have, any kind of state that has a rural area, you'll have a lot of Republican voters. But what's the sentiment of the people in Minneapolis and in the state to what's going on? And maybe
Um,
the polls.
well, I think the polls reflect that even those who identify as Republican or as independent are troubled by what they see as the excesses of ICE. What I've seen in the polls and also in reader commentary on like the Minnesota Star Tribune, which is the largest newspaper in Minnesota, website, is that they're saying, yes, if somebody is undocumented here and here illegally, they should be deported, but this is not the way to do that. Um, I think that ICE's tactics of and some of the really vivid footage we've seen of them pulling people out of cars and attacking people in their homes and using battering rams to break down doors. I think even people who would say they don't agree with undocumented individuals being here, they would say this is not necessary. And the other thing that I've seen several people remark on, which I think is notable, is that yes, we have undocumented people here in this state, but in terms of the numbers, not to mention the percentage of population, it pales in comparison to the numbers in states like Texas and Florida, where we are not seeing this kind of activity. And I think people recognize that too, that this is overkill. As you probably heard, there are supposedly 3,000 federal agents operating here in the Twin Cities, which is considerably more than our entire police force for both the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And um, I think it's clear that given the numbers that they claim exist, assuming taking for the sake of argument that they're accurate, there's really just no justification for that volume. And the fact that they're going into the outstate areas, as we call them here, I think is also raising some concerns because, and this is commonplace sort of observation that it's easy for individuals to kind of get sucked into the narrative about how all of these individuals are murderers and rapists and terrible criminals that have no business being here and so forth. But then when you get out into the outstate areas where people are working in poultry and meat processing plants and things like that. They're the neighbors of people
Right.
as they're being swept up. I saw an interview with a guy that's running a liquor store in Wilmer, and he says our sales have plummeted because people are afraid to come out. So even I think if you didn't, from like a moral perspective, have concerns about this, from just an economic perspective, this is having a real impact on small businesses and even large businesses, and even on the city of St. Paul. I think you and I talked about this before we began, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. As you probably have heard, we've had some severe weather here in the Twin Cities,
Oh
and
no, we do never have severe weather in Minnesota.
well, it's very cold at the moment,
Oh yeah.
but we've also had snow, and the city of St. Paul operates snow plows, and one of the snowplow operators was taken by ICE and has already been shipped to El Paso, Texas. And the guy from the Department of Public Works said, look, he's got all his papers, he's documented, he's got his commercial driver's license. We do background checks on anybody we hire for St. Paul. He has no criminal record. What's going on here? And I think those kinds of anecdotal things where we're getting some kind of information about who these individuals are. The other story that got quite a bit of play involved a guy who was in his car with his little kids who was taking his son or bringing his son back from basketball practice, and they got sprayed with some kind of toxic substance. I don't know if it was pepper spray or some kind of gas, and the baby
Yeah, the
was
baby, yeah.
seriously injured. And I mean, it's better now, but again, this was a situation where there was no dispute that this guy was a US citizen and that he was not even involved in any of this. He simply was going from point to point, carrying out his usual business. And I think these kinds of things are not helping um, the narrative about what is going on here.
Yeah, and he's Hispanic, right? If I recall, the guy was Hispanic.
I'm not sure he's Hispanic. He's black, but I
Oh, he's
don't think
black.
he's
Okay. All
Hispanic.
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
which again, and I mean, he's a person of color.
Right,
Yes,
exactly. They're
but
going after any non-white person.
right.
What's the just some general stats? So what's the population of Minnesota and what's the population of Minneapolis? And what, in general terms, I mean, and what are we talking about in terms of because I want to get into the Somalian community in detail, but what are we talking about in terms of like the agricultural sector employing workers coming in from other parts of the world to work, as we see happens all over the place in the United States in the rural sectors. But what are the numbers and that you could share with us and just give us a broad sense of the proportionality of this, and why do they pick on Minneapolis in particular? That's sort of because we're going for Los Angeles, then Chicago, Washington. They've threatened New York, but now they're focusing on Minneapolis.
Well, the population of Minneapolis proper is around 425,000,
So it's a small city. Okay.
when you add St. Paul, because the cities kind of blend into each other, it's another 300,000. So we're talking about 725 to 750,000. But the greater metropolitan area is much bigger than that. It's nearly 4 million people,
Hmm.
because we have lots of suburbs and small bedroom communities and so forth that are considered part of the metro area. Um, I'd have to look up the
By the way,
population of the state of Minnesota because I don't know exactly what it is. Of course, the other big urban areas here are up in the north with Duluth, and then south of here it's not anywhere as big, but the city of Rochester is the other major population hub in the state.
okay. Now, in terms of the how this has occurred, what's the sort of history of Minneapolis being a sanctuary city? And explain, because not everybody knows this term. It gets thrown around. What's your understanding about this whole concept, how it started?
Well, let's kind of back up a step and talk about Minnesota's history as being sort of a refuge for refugees from a variety of countries. This is something that goes back to the Vietnam War. We had quite a number of refugees come here from Laos and Hmong refugees,
Lungs.
and so there's been that's been a significant part of the international population here for, as I said, ever since basically the Vietnam War. And the new mayor of St. Paul is actually Hmong, and we have Hmongs that are in the or people of Hmong heritage that are in the legislature and hold other prominent offices in the state. So most people would say that they are really assimilated. The majority of that population is at least initially was in St. Paul, and there's still a big population of them there. Then, of course, we have the refugees that you've seen in other urban areas like Washington, D.C., where I worked for and lived for many years. People from El Salvador and other places in Central America. And then the Somali population. Um, and I can tell you from my own experience that we now have first, second generation students at the University of Minnesota who are Somali or the children of Somali immigrants. And we have, again, elected officials, particularly in our city governments, who represent those individuals. So um, I wasn't here at the beginning. I have only lived here since 1999. But I can tell you this has always been a state, and some people would say it has something to do with sort of the Scandinavian heritage. It's actually kind of interesting because everybody thinks that Minnesota is this majority Scandinavian, and actually it has a higher percentage of people with German heritage than Scandinavian. But Lutheran, I guess you would say in any event, very public spirited and oriented towards helping people along the way. And it's just, I'm not trying to paint a picture that we're all angels here. It's just kind of baked into the culture
Hmm.
here in the state.
Talk specifically about the Somalian community. Why Minneapolis? I mean, you're saying this is sort of a vestige of the Vietnam War when Hmongs were brought in from Laos, et cetera, at the end of the war. But why did Somalians come to Minneapolis as opposed to other parts of the country? Because now they're talking about concentrating in Maine. I didn't realize there was a Somalian community in Maine. But why Minneapolis?
Um, a lot of people actually trace it to the meat packing industry
Ah,
here.
okay.
Hormel Foods is here in Austin in the southern part of the state. And also there were Marshall, Minnesota is another place where there's substantial meat packing. They came here after the Civil War in Somalia, and as I think often happens, when some Somalis came, then their friends, families, and others came here as well. Ilhan Omar, who is my representative to Congress, is a Somali, and the Twin Cities kind of became a hub. And one of the things that we often hear when people are criticizing the Twin Cities and the Somali population is that, to be honest, part of what attracted them was we had, at least the time they came in the 1990s, very robust social services that they could avail themselves of.
Okay, and that, of course, you have the whole tradition of the DFL, the Democratic Farm Labor Party, that was unique in the Midwest, but certainly in Minnesota. And there's a tradition of social democracy that's different than other parts of the United States, at least at the state level. Um, Now, just tell us a little bit about how the Somali community has evolved, and in particular, shed your light on the scandals, quote, that we see. Because, I'm a New Yorker. Anybody who's familiar with ethnic histories of any part of the United States always knows that there's always some part of an ethnic group that comes to the United States that decides to get involved in criminal activities, and that's just being an American, frankly. And but just shed some light from your perspective about this whole bugaboo about the Somalians that has been used by the Trump administration to essentially demonize them as a community.
Well, I think 2 points I would make. One is that the current focus on the scandals arriving with rising from Feeding Our Future, which was the big scam that purported to be providing food for children during the pandemic. I mean, that's was kind of the perfect storm, I think, that contributed to this. I mean, I'm not here to make excuses for the state or for the city. But what essentially happened was that during the crises of the um, pandemic, there was an acute need to make sure that children, school-age children who could not go to school, excuse me, were being fed. And so this group stepped in, offering to provide the food, to make it available, to deliver it in some places, to have centralized like kitchens where it could be distributed. The brains behind it was not a person that was Somali. But as is so often the case when we're dealing with, again, a diaspora population, there were, groups of individuals that had created networks. I mean, yes, we have Somali gangs here as well, and they tapped into that and there were grifters that were involved, and there's no excuse for it. There's no justification for it. But I mean, to my mind, that is what happened. And when the stories broke several years ago now, the investigations were launched, and there have been prosecutions, and people have been convicted. So it's an ongoing process to address it. But no, there's no. I mean, but yes, it without question, the fraud did occur.
Okay. And then you have this situation where, these have been ongoing. I understand there was over 80 prosecutions that were successful. Plus, you mentioned this woman who was in charge of this feeding program. Um, well, then you have Nick Shirley come into the picture, and just
Yeah.
give us your sense of all that, because Nick Shirley, of course, is an influencer. He is a YouTube conservative online person, uh, building up, his video, as we know, got what, 130 million views around the world. It always astounds me, knowing the Nielsen ratings of television stations and radio
Yeah.
shows, how these things just blow my mind. But um, just give your sense of that whole incident that just happened a few weeks ago, and it's one of the reasons why I sought you out. But
Yeah. It was right after Christmas that the video went viral. I think it was December 26th or thereabouts that it was posted. And it lasts about 43 minutes. And what it purports to be is an expose focusing primarily on daycare centers. with the argument being that there are a number of these centers that have been set up basically as shell operations, and that his thing was to go around to them to make a revelation about how they were bogus. If for those who haven't watched it, it begins with him talking with a guy he identifies only by his first name as David, who waves around a stack of papers and says that this is evidence that he got from a contact in the state legislature, which has been involved in the investigation. I mean, it's a criminal investigation, but the legislature's been doing its own investigation as well, that purports to show the whole fraudulent activity in that particular sector. And then Shirley and his buddy David go around to these daycare centers unannounced, shows up, bang on the door, asks where the children are, asks to be let in. And in at least two instances in the viral video, Nick Shirley says, I want to find a place to place my little son, Joey, who needs a daycare center. So how would I go about applying for that? I mean, based on what I know of Nick Shirley, I don't think he has a child. I think it's completely a lie in what he was doing. But essentially, what he was doing was, as the British say, doorstepping, showing up unannounced to do an ambush interview. And then when people quite logically refused to let the strangers into places where supposedly children were being cared for, he used that as to bolster his argument that this is all fraudulent. Now, all I know about him is what I've read about him, but the Guardian in the UK did a piece on him and other influencers back in the fall. He apparently has ties to the Trump administration. He is, as you said, a conservative right-wing influencer. He attended some roundtable last fall in Washington at the White House or adjacent to the White House, and has basically told Trump that he'll do anything he can to help him. And that is all so, okay, fair enough. But if you watch his video, there's nothing that reveals those ties or those connections. He purports to be an independent investigative journalist. That's how he styles himself in the video. And when I was watching it, it reminded me very much of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas, which many of you probably remember from
Just
several
remind
years
people what
ago.
that is. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and again, another right-wing influencer who has been involved in a number of similar kinds of exercises, generally aimed at liberal groups, liberal causes, liberal politicians, where he shows up, or one of his staff shows up, cameras rolling, sometimes obviously, sometimes surreptitiously, and all bent on exposing hypocrisy or fraud or something like that among these groups. And O'Keefe and Project Veritas, I believe, have now parted company. I think there were questions about some of the techniques that O'Keefe was using, and there have been a number of criminal charges brought against O'Keefe and others for things like, using hidden cameras in states where it's not legal to do that kind of thing. But what is, I think, the link between the two of these is that I would say that they're not transparent about who they are, about what their motives are, what their agenda is. They frequently lie, either overtly or by omission, as they're engaging in their investigations. And they don't explain that they go in basically with an agenda. And certainly, I think a lot of their news gathering techniques, if I can call them that, are of doubtful ethical, from an ethical standpoint, but some of them are unlawful. I'm not saying anything that Nick Shirley did was unlawful. I haven't seen any evidence of that. But again, O'Keefe has been charged with illegal conduct along the way. But even if that were not really the case, and I as somebody who has defended journalists for a long time, I want journalists to have as much protection as possible when they're undergoing or engaging in news gathering. But the fact is, on occasions, O'Keefe has flat out violated the law, and that's not something that mainstream journalists typically would do.
Hmm. Yeah, as I understand it, some of the critiques I've read about Shirley is that he picked times when these places wouldn't have kids anyway there, or he went into places that were out of business. I mean, there was a whole bunch of questionable practices that they did when they sort of cherry picked what they did. But nevertheless, the impact has been what it was. Uh,
And I think it has been in part because again, it's not the world in which I operate, but apparently he already had a following among certain conservative right-wing groups. His affiliation with the Trump administration helped to amplify what he was saying. And one thing that I found interesting, because I was called upon to comment on some of this for other media reporting, was that I then got um, really nasty emails back from people who had seen my comments on Shirley, and they really either deliberately or I don't know, uh, they misinterpreted my point because they would say things like, well, don't you believe there's any fraud in Minnesota? And I mean, of course I believe there's fraud in Minnesota. I know there is. It's been adjudicated. But that's not the point. The point was that, as you said, what Shirley was doing was not, in fact, um, building evidence for that. He was simply engaging in this ambush exercise without being at all clear or transparent about the basis for what he was doing. And as you said, in some instances at least, going to these places in times when it was not reasonable to expect that anybody even would have been there. Um, so, you know, I, the issue is not whether there's been fraud in Minnesota. The question was whether his so-called reporting was actually doing anything to uncover anything new or revelatory about that. And I would push
yeah.
back against that.
Yeah, well, one thing I've watched his videos over the past couple of months, and he'd go to a demonstration, he'd go to the King marches, for example, and sort of insert himself. And an average person in a King's march is going to be rather open, but the person who's being interviewed doesn't realize they're going on a live stream.
Right.
And so they're being seen by 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people. And he's using them as dramatic foils for his conservative narrative, which, okay, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But then what I find deceptive is not really identifying himself. And then, of course, when he's actually chased in demonstrations by people who know he is, he basically freaks out. Another thing he did was he went down to an area in New York where there are people who are clearly, uh, you know, selling illegal property on the street. And this has been going on in New York for like time immemorial.
Forever.
Oh yeah, forever. And I'm saying to
Right.
myself, like, what is this big revelation? But for again, it's like chasing after, in this particular case, African, street vendors, and just basically using this to whip up and sort of send out that message again with a live stream to people who, oh, here are these people, these aliens we have to deport. And it's quite reprehensible. Now, I want to also get into the question of Waltz. Now, as this Shirley piece comes out, it does, trigger the Trump administration to up the ante in Minneapolis. They use it as an excuse to send in more federal agents. But describe this whole relationship of Governor Waltz to this. I mean, is this just Trump going after him because he was the vice presidential candidate for Harris? What do you make of all that?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that that's front and center. President Trump has essentially declared war on Minnesota because he's declared war on Tim Walz, and I think it to a certain extent the wind's been taken out of his sails now that Walz has announced that he will not seek a third term as governor. It would have been a rough row for Walz even without the Nick Shirley viral video, because this scandal has been a big deal here in Minnesota. It's not as if we all just were whistling past the graveyard and acted like none of this happened. There have been multiple investigations, there have been convictions. People are going to jail. People don't here in Minnesota don't like to see their money stolen any more than anybody else does. And it was going to be difficult for Waltz to weather that. He's been effective as a governor in some respects, but I think on the other hand, the loss in the election of 2024, hurt him. It did. How could it not? Because there was a lot of stuff that came out about Waltz in terms of just the sort of the attacks from the Trump campaign that um, were things people had not really necessarily focused on here. In any event, I think Trump's vendetta is it's very simple. He doesn't like Waltz. He doesn't like somebody that would have had the temerity to challenge him. He doesn't like the state, which has not gone for him either time. And you know, I, I can't get into Trump's brain to figure out why he's focusing specifically on Minnesota, but certainly his animosity towards Waltz has not helped. And it also hasn't helped because you mentioned sanctuary cities, and I didn't really answer your question about that. It's interesting that you mentioned it because one of the former police chiefs of Minnesota was on one of our local talk shows today, and somebody was asking her, what does that really mean,
Yeah.
sanctuary city? And what she said was that as police chief, her interpretation was that the police would not ask people, whether they were documented, undocumented, illegal, legal, that was not their role, that was not what they were going to do. That the kind of show us your papers things that we're seeing ICE doing, they would not do that. Now, did that mean that they were going to condone people that were here without documentation? No, if you arrest somebody and they're not documented, then that adds to the pot of things that that individual could be charged with, and referrals might be made to ICE or Customs and Border Protection or something like that. But the point is that this idea of sanctuary city as being this haven for people that do not have documentation, I've never understood that to be the interpretation. I think there have been issues about things like undocumented aliens being able to get driver's licenses, for example, here. And the argument in favor of that was quite simply, if we don't let them get driver's licenses, then that means they're going to be driving without a driver's license, and that endangers other people as well as themselves. If you're an undocumented alien, you can't get a real ID here. And this is a state that was quite late in terms of implementing real ID for a variety of reasons. We've had for a long time something called an enhanced driver's license that exists in states that border either the Canadian or the Mexican border. I have one of those. I've had it for a long time. It allows you to drive over the border with just your driver's license. You don't need a passport. You can also use it to travel on water. And they act effectively like a real ID, and that's why I went ahead and got it. But if you're an undocumented alien, you can't get one of those either. All you can get is a driver's license or a state ID, which does not act as real ID. So, but the argument has been, well, allowing them to do that is just the next step to letting them vote as non-citizens. And Minnesota does have, we have the ability to register on the day of an election, show up at your polling place and you can register right there. And of course, this is something that the Trump administration and its supporters don't approve of and would like to do away with. So, I mean, there's just a lot in the way our state has been structured that makes it sort of like shooting fish in a barrel, because we're kind of the poster children for so many of the things that the Trump administration and its supporters don't like.
Yeah, I know in New York they'll let a non-citizen get a New York City ID, and then that allows them to get a a driver's license. I mean, some New Yorkers here can correct me, but I think you can get with that a state ID that's a non-driver's license ID. But they did that precisely because of this problem. because of undocumented people working. And, because New York is filled with people who work like that. Uh,
Right.
now, so the tempo of ICE operations, when does that seem to ramp up to you? Is that after Nick Shirley? Is that before Nick Shirley? Is there a break with that?
Um, it had already begun before Nick Shirley's video, which again was at the end of December. After I would say in the fall was when we started to see it happening, and I'm talking about this immediate past fall of 2025. I'm not talking about 2024. Um, I, I but the surge, in which is what they call it, metro surge. I can't recall exactly when that began, but I know that many of my colleagues who live in a variety of parts of the Twin Cities, and I live in an area of the Twin Cities that's not that far from where a lot of this is happening, but we don't have a big population of international individuals in my immediate neighborhood. But my friends who do have said that these operations of ICE have been going on for weeks now.
Ah,
It's just that it's been stepped up quite a bit since the very first of the year.
I see. Okay, and of course we've seen them amp it up. You mentioned earlier the amount of personnel they've sent in is actually larger than the law enforcement of both
Right.
St. Paul and Minneapolis itself. And then you get this situation where you have this constant animosity with Ilhan Omar that goes back into Trump 1.0 that has
Yes.
spilled over into this new situation. Now, one of the big thousand-pound gorillas in the background of this is the impact of the George Floyd murder several years ago, because
Yes.
where this incident occurs, which we'll get to in a moment about with Renee Good, it's just a few blocks away from where that happened.
That's
So
right.
give us your sense of that, because that had a huge, I mean, that triggered a national, international reaction, similar to what we saw in the encampment movement in the past several years with Gaza, with the war in Gaza between Israel and the Palestinians. So, what's your take on all that? The impact of Floyd?
Well, there's so many pieces to this, and I'm going to try to be concise. I think it is no secret to anybody who's lived in the Twin Cities for any period of time that we've had issues with primarily the Minneapolis Police Department, but also St. Paul Police and our Black population. Not specifically Somali, but African American population, as we used to call them, and it's been an issue of, Floyd was sort of the culmination of a variety of incidents that occurred. Philando Castile's another one that people have probably heard about, with arrests, shakedowns that led to, in some cases, the death of the subject. And a friend of mine, my neighbor actually, who was a photo editor at the Star Tribune for many years, said that, among journalists, the Minneapolis police were notorious in terms of their interaction with our population of color. That St. Paul had a better equilibrium, but Minneapolis was a problem. In any event, whether that's exactly true or not true, that was certainly the perception among our population here. And as people will probably remember, the George Floyd thing happened in the middle of the pandemic. And so we had a lot of things that were kind of coming together at once. Darnella Frazier happened to be there and was able to record what was going on with her cell phone camera. Had that not happened, I think it would be the outcome probably would have been a lot different. There were many debates and discussions about whether what Derek Chauvin and the other police officers that were with him were actually techniques that they'd been trained to do, or whether they'd been trained not to do them. And this became a big cause celeb years later in a documentary that a journalist who used to be with one of our network affiliates here and has now gone off to do her own thing with something called Alpha News, basically said it was all a lie, that it was a vile slander of how the police are trained. But in any event, the point is, this had been simmering for a long time. And as you said, it went international. And not only, and this is kind of my own little parochial thing about this. When I first moved here in 1999, one of the things that I was really bothered by was the fact that Minnesota basically did not allow cameras in their courts, state courts. Of course, federal courts is a different matter. Um, and I remember I actually testified before the Supreme Court here, the state Supreme Court at one point, about this, and was just told that Minnesota has a much better um, attitude toward protecting criminal defendants, victims, and others, that we have Minnesota exceptionalism here, and the fact that it works fine in our neighboring state of Wisconsin proves nothing, so on and so forth. Well, of course, what happened was that because of COVID and the quarantine restrictions that were set up, it was not going to be possible for the public to attend the Derek Chauvin trial. And so the presiding judge, Judge Cahill, made the really extraordinary order to allow cameras in the trial. And that kind of cracked the glass ceiling that had kept us from having cameras in our trial courts. It's not 100% now, but it's much easier to get cameras into criminal proceedings than it was prior to that. And his reasoning was simply that, given the high profile nature of this case and the strong feelings about it, that the public would never have any confidence in the outcome, whatever it would be, because he made this ruling before the trial even began. But regardless of the outcome, if the public couldn't see it, they weren't going to trust the result. And so, if anything good came out of that, that was one thing. And the other thing that came out of it was that there was a big Justice Department investigation based on a civil rights suit that was brought by the ACLU, which led to a consent decree and order and settlement that the city of Minneapolis had to enter into, specifically dealing with how law enforcement dealt not just with people of color, but also with protesters and with journalists. And I emphasize this only to say that this is another reason why ICE's tactics are so discordant here now, because having gone through all of that and having law enforcement gone through major training, and if you've seen our current police chief, O'Hara, he's quite articulate and very good, I think, when he does media appearances. But I think he really believes what he says, which is part of our role as law enforcement is to preserve the First Amendment rights of the public, and that's what we're going to do. So to have ICE come in here and do the exact
They throw that
opposite,
out the door. They throw
it
that.
just throws it out the door, because I mean, our police, as we said, are completely outnumbered by ICE, and in any event, they're often not present when ICE is conducting these operations. So it's sort of beside the point. I mean, they were there yesterday with Jack Lang, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, as ICE is upping up the operations, and this is very interesting because you do the idea of Minneapolis exceptionalism, and that is a very important point, how the impact of Floyd, politically on the grassroots level, because whenever I talk to friends of mine who grew up in Minneapolis, they always bring that up. That, how that affected them personally. Uh, how have you seen the resistance? When did you start seeing this sort of grassroots resistance, the people trailing them in cars, going to churches, and let's organize our emergency responses to this? When did that start? Did that start in the fall or even before that?
Well, of course, there were kind of the beginnings of it during the various No Kings rallies and so forth, which we certainly had here in the Twin Cities. I mean, the issue of ICE was always there as sort of one of the central issues. But I think most of this has actually happened since the fall into the beginning of the year. Now we have a variety of civil society and other activist groups that are conducting formal trainings for people and turn how to be what they call constitutional observers and things like that. I mean, there was always outreach coming from things like churches and other religious groups in terms of providing sort of general support to this population. But I think the idea of becoming the observers and those who are going to document what ICE is doing really took off at the end of last year.
Okay. Now, when I look at the videos, because the videos are coming out every day, And I know a little bit about the 1862 Sioux Uprising, so I know that Fort Whipple, Fort Snelling, is where the mass hanging occurs.
Right.
Um, that's where you have the ICE, sort of their headquarters, I guess, for Minneapolis, for the Twin City area. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
it's technically in Minneapolis, but it's not in the kind of city proper. It's south of Minneapolis, basically between downtown Minneapolis and the airport, Minneapolis Airport.
Mhm.
If you ever have ridden the light rail, there's a stop on our light rail. That's the Fort Snelling stop, and that's where the Whipple building is.
And that's where we've seen these confrontations. You'll have people come from all over the United States coming in there to mess with the ICE people. Um, so what is your take on what happened with Renee Good? Because, it's still conflicting. Was she part of a watch group tailing them? And then this is what led to her getting shot. I mean, what's your take? How do you understand what happened there?
Well, there still are a variety of narratives that are emerging about this, so I'm reluctant to say it was X or it was
Right.
Y. But what appears to me to have been the situation was that, her story is, or her widow's story is, that she had dropped their child off at school and then was indeed involved in at least following some of the ICE operations that were taking place not that far from her child's school. What it looks to me like what happened was that, as we mentioned before, we've had a little snow and ice here in the Twin Cities. One of the ICE vehicles got stuck in the snow. She found herself basically juxtaposed to that particular vehicle. ICE's version is she was trying to block them in. That's not her story. You'd have to look at the video, I guess, and draw your own conclusion. But what does appear to be the case is that she was getting conflicting instructions from different ICE agents about what they wanted her to do, whether they wanted her to leave, whether they wanted her to get out of her vehicle, whether they wanted her to stop. Exactly, there was confusion. And of course, it all happened in a relatively short period of time.
Mm.
What I find, interesting about it was the fact that the Jonathan Ross, who is the guy who shot her, was holding a gun and also holding his cell phone and recording the encounter. I was curious about this and I looked up the rules and regulations under which ICE is supposed to operate. First of all, they're supposed to be wearing body cameras, except under specific circumstances where they don't have to. We all know that the use of body cameras is often spotty with law enforcement. So the fact that they didn't have a body camera in and of itself doesn't surprise me, but I think they were supposed to have it. But what they do say is they're not supposed to be using a personal cell phone
Mm.
to record things. I mean, it specifically says that. And yet he was with one hand and holding his gun with the other. And then you had Renee Good's then wife standing off to one side. There was some kind of a back and forth exchange. They're characterizing it as being threatening. I think most people that watched it would say suggesting that somebody should go to lunch, is not threatening. But be that as it may, I guess perception is everything. Um, what it looked like to me was that she was not trying to hit Jonathan Ross. Um, I think she was trying to drive away. And it seems to me that he had an obligation, which is, as I understand it, just law enforcement protocol, that you don't put yourself in front of a vehicle where you're going to get hit. And it seemed to me that he did not step aside when he could have. But, you know, it's the old Marx Brother question of, you're going to believe me or your lying eyes. I think people have to look at the video and draw their own conclusions. It would be, you probably have heard that some guy who is seeking to run for governor in this state has always said he's going to step up and provide counsel to Jonathan Ross if he needs it, although he understands that the Justice Department will defend him if that becomes necessary. But there have been several high-powered lawyer firms that have stepped up to represent Renee Good's family in any kind of action that might be taken against him.
Interesting. So so we'll see some sort of legal action because today, of course, they announced that I believe the D Department of Justice announced they're not going to do anything with Ross.
That's what the DOJ said. Again, on the news that are on, I think it was Face the Nation this morning, Kristi Noem said that her own ICE, Homeland Security, whatever, would be doing its own investigation, but I don't know exactly what that means.
And for you as a lawyer who has, and also worked as a journalist, I mean, what do you compare this to from a journalistic sense? What does any cases come up to, because, you listen to people argue about these videos, and it's obvious that the wheels are turning to the right to get out of there. And then, oh no, it wasn't that. She was going to step on the gas and knock this guy over. And then you get into the whole question of he was several months before severely injured in a situation
Right.
like this. And then we know there is the Supreme Court cases that essentially give great dispensation to police officers to use deadly force in a situation if he feels it's self-defense. But what do you compare this to? And from your experience teaching about the ethics of media and law over the years.
Well, I mean, I think, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I'm not in a position to be able to provide, what I think would be a valid
Sharp
analysis of,
analogy, yeah.
because truly, I think it would come down to if there were an investigation. In many respects, I'll just take the simple example. I compare it to the Derek Chauvin case. Was he kneeling on George Floyd's neck? Was the pressure that he put on his neck, was that the cause of death? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that have to get parsed out in
Right.
an investigation or in a trial. And even if you've got video that seems definitive, I mean, I've talked to people who I would consider to be, not Trump supporters, but they looked at it and said, I'm not sure. Maybe she really was reckless in pulling away. And then the other question is sort of the reasonableness of Jonathan Ross's conduct. I'm not an expert on that, but it does seem to me that somebody who had this previous experience that you mentioned, where he claimed he was dragged, for several yards by a car in an altercation he had earlier this year and another eye separation or late last year, that led to him having to have 33 stitches and all this kind of stuff. Then the question becomes, was it reasonable for him to be out conducting these obligations,
Operation, yeah.
operations? Was he not in a situation, in a good place where he could act reasonably, as somebody in his position would have to do? So, I mean, this could be a case, if it were actually brought to some kind of either civil or criminal prosecution, that would ultimately turn into eyewitness testimony, testimony from him, testimony from the other ICE agents, testimony from Renee Good's widow. I don't know. In terms of the journalistic ethics of this, I think the biggest question that these days would come up for any kind of a journalist that was getting this video, and of course we're getting it from a number of different sources, and yet of course there's no body cam footage, so we don't have an official source to start from. But you would say we've got to be able to verify that this is what it purports to be. Has it been edited? Has it been doctored in some way? Is it a deep fake? I mean, those are all the questions that you have to do. You have to authenticate footage that you're going to share. And I think you can certainly have plenty of disclaimers, and that's what we saw here, because this footage was here as wallpaper here in the Twin Cities after the horrible incident occurred. Um, that's the biggest thing. I mean, ultimately, you can't tell people what it says. I know the New York Times did an analysis earlier this week that purports to be a second by second analysis, and they've come to their own conclusions about what that means. I think that's all useful, but I think by the same token, we were talking before about video and things like that. A journalist can always I think be in a position to vouch for the accuracy of footage that they shot themselves. But when you're getting it from a third party, which is what all this footage is, because there were no press present at the time, you always have to be careful about saying, here's what we've got. We've authenticated as much as we can. Here's what it looks like to experts that have analyzed it, but we can't tell you that the answer is yes or no, because ultimately that's a fact-finding mission that somebody else has to do.
Yeah, you mentioned the case of this person was stopped and his child was nearly killed. This baby was nearly killed in the back. I think they had to resuscitate her, but they had to give her
Right.
CPR. But there was that other case of three Venezuelans. One of who, and do you have any sense of that? Because it's sort of murky what happened there. They're saying that they were associated with gang activity. It was a targeted Title 8 raid, et cetera. What do you have any sense of what happened with that particular case?
I think I don't have an
No,
answer for that. I'm hearing all the same
got it.
versions that you're hearing, and I think we have one version that DHS and ICE is giving us. There are, friends and family members that are giving us a different version. I don't know. I can't answer
Got it.
that question.
Okay, now we are in a situation now where Trump is sitting there, he's maneuvering with, I was going to ask you about Greenland at some point. We can talk about that. But, you have this absurdity with Greenland going on. And then you have this alerting of basically a brigade of troops in Alaska, part of the 11th Airborne Division, to be sent in to implement the Emergency Powers Act of the president. And what do you sense of that whole thing? The way they're dangling that, the way that becomes like this, you know, because I would personally think that at some point he's going to push this through. But why do you think what's constraining him from doing that?
Well, what does he tell us? The only thing that constrains him is his own morality. That's what he
Right,
said
right, right,
himself, right?
right, right.
I got to tell you, when he was first earlier this week, I mean, this has all happened so fast. When he was first talking about invoking the Insurrection Act, I thought, that's just, bizarre because, as I'm sure you and your listeners know, the Insurrection Act hasn't been invoked, since 1992, and it typically only occurs when the governor of the state or equivalent seeks that kind of support from the government. Because as a general proposition of the Posse Comitatus Act, law enforcement or military has no business engaging in operations among the civilian population. When I heard about the Alaskan brigade or battalion or whatever it is, I'm sorry, I don't know the correct terminology.
Brigade,
It
gone.
it it, it I on the one hand, of course, I was horrified. I mean, the people have been commenting here. We have a number of skyscrapers here in the Twin Cities. There's nothing like New York, but there's a Art Deco tower called the Fauché Tower that's kind of a well-known architectural Art Deco kind of gem. And people were saying, so are they going to send the paratroopers? They're going to be jumping out of planes and their parachutes will get stuck on the Fauché Tower.
Wow.
And of course, it's kind of, gallows humor. But on the other hand, I'm sure you know that in Chicago, they actually were dropping ICE agents on helicopters and having them
Right.
rappel down buildings in Chicago. So, it's the kind of thing that sounds funny until it
Yeah,
happens.
correct.
The other thing that I thought about, though, was that several years ago, I was actually in Alaska and I was chatting with somebody in a restaurant in Homer, Alaska, down on the Kenai Peninsula. And they asked, where are you from? And I said, Minnesota. And the waitress said, oh, I could never live in Minnesota. It's too cold there. So I was thinking about these guys that are based in Alaska, and everybody's been talking about how the ICE guys that are here right at the moment are mainly, it appears, from the southern United States, and they're not used to our temperatures here. I'm not so sure the Alaska folks will be either, but be that as it may, I would go along with the idea, and it may be a conspiracy theory, that in a way this is a blind, and what those troops are really intended for is to be deployed to Greenland. I don't think they're going to come to Minnesota. I could be wrong about that. I mean, I may have troops marching down my street in due course, or parachuting into the University of Minnesota campus or something. But it seems that even for Trump, that may be a bridge too far, because you know, as overblown as the reaction was to the riots and demonstrations that occurred after George Floyd's death, the fact was we had problems here in Twin Cities after that happened. I mean, my um, uh, post office was burned down.
Yeah, your precinct was
And
attacked.
my precinct was attacked and basically non-operational for several years after that. Governor Walz was not exactly handling things an aggressive way, and in the eyes of many, that was seen as a dereliction of duty. I mean, my view was he was trying to strike a balance. And one of the things he did that I personally applauded was when there was a curfew instituted in the Twin Cities. Governor Walz said, but that doesn't apply to journalists because journalists have to be out there and able to report. So I thought he was doing as good a job as he could. But the fact was the video of the burning and looting and so forth, even though it was confined to a relatively small area. I mean, I can attest to that because I live about 7 blocks from George Floyd Square, and my personal area was not bothered at all. I mean, I'm just a few blocks south of Lake Street, which is a major hub of the Somali and Hispanic population, and in my immediate area, there was no problem at all. So it was highly contained, but it was highly spectacular. Anyway, my point is just to say we're not anywhere in that situation now. I mean, it's nothing like that. And given that the only possible justification to bring in even the National Guard, much less any kind of military troops, would be true urban chaos, that's not where we are. And to the extent that we're having any kind of issues, it's frankly being caused by ICE's presence. It's not something that was created by our own residents.
Right. And of course, that's what they're saying isn't the case. But anyway, all right. So people who want to comment or ask questions to Professor Kirtley, just raise your hands and I'll get to you in the order that they're raised. Um, just trust me, I can keep on talking.
Well, I could too, but
Uh,
I don't want to keep people from the football game.
Anybody, Michael or Tom, you have a comment or question, Tom?
Well, no, I think I agree with what's been said. You know, the um, that part of the country. I guess maybe I didn't realize. Of course, I've been to Minnesota. I've been all over the place, but I didn't realize that they were that radical. Well, I don't want to say radical, but that were that excited about it.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. Michael, go on, Michael.
Uh, well, first of all, I want to thank you for being on. Do you know? Well, first, I have several questions. I'll just start with a couple. First of all, these so-called influencers have come in
Hmm.
um, and claim they're journalists. Now, when I was training as a journalist, there were a couple of things you needed. One, either experience as a journalist working for a journalistic institution, or training as a journalist. That is, you actually took classes when you were in college or even high school, um, and press credentials
Hmm.
from a journalistic institution. Did any of these guys have any of that?
Well, let me start and say, to my knowledge, these people have no journalistic training or affiliation. Um, one of the tricky things about that, and I'm speaking here as a lawyer and somebody who's defended journalists for a long time, is that unlike in some countries, you mentioned press credentials, but we don't license journalists here. I mean, you go to some other countries and you've got to be a card carrying journalist with a license that is issued by the state. Well, that's unconstitutional in this country. So we don't have any mechanism like that. And it's been interesting here in the Twin Cities because, as I said, I've lived here for about 26 years. And when the Republican National Convention was in St. Paul back in the early 2000s, I forget exactly when it was, the whole issue of press credentialing kind of raised its head because the Republican National Committee and the police, particularly in St. Paul, but of course there were activities here in Minneapolis too, started suddenly talking about press credentials. But the interesting thing was that government issued press credentials weren't a thing here. I mean, you didn't go to the St. Paul cops and get a press credential or something like that. That wasn't how it was done. Maybe again, another example of Minnesota exceptionalism. People might have a business card from their news organization, but that was it. And of course, even since that time, the media scape has drastically changed and evolved. Who people consider to be journalists, and by that I mean people like Nick Shirley's audience. I mean, they think he's a journalist. I don't think he's a journalist, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a following. And the tricky thing that came up here, and not just here, but has arisen in recent years, is that you have people that are doing journalistic-like things in the sense that they are gathering information and then they're, putting it up in the cloud or they're posting it online or whatever, often in real time, often without any kind of particular vetting or context or anything like that. And I'm not saying you have to do that. I mean, during the George Floyd riots, several of our journalists at the Star Tribune were doing live feeds, and so it's not that it necessarily has to be, but of course they had all of the support and credibility, I would say, of being associated with a news organization. Anyway, we had talked about this in our conversation yesterday, Jim and I, and the whole question of how there's a population out there that doesn't trust the mainstream media, that by their own lights, somebody like Nick Shirley is more credible simply because he has no affiliation, because he has no prior training, that he's going to tell you the truth as opposed to those highly compromised mainstream media that are driven by corporate concerns or political concerns or whatever the case might be. And so I think, one of the issues that has come up in the current ICE operations, but also very much during the George Floyd era, was how and whether people that did not have journalistic affiliations but were doing journalism would be treated by police and so forth. I mean, the general idea is that journalists don't get special protections. They get the same protections that anybody else does. In some states, there are specific statutory protections that exist for them. But here in Minnesota, we really don't have anything like that. Our League of Cities has sort of policies about how you're supposed to deal with journalists, but short of the consent decree that came out after George Floyd, there really isn't any legal obligation on the part of police to give journalists greater protection than anybody else would have. The key is, are you impeding law enforcement? And if you're not, they should be leaving you alone, because whether you're a journalist or an influencer or just a bystander, you have a First Amendment right to be there and to record what you're doing. As I alluded to at the beginning, my own interpretation is that what Nick Shirley is doing is not journalism in the way I was taught and the way I teach it. But for some people out there, they think he's giving them the unvarnished truth that the mainstream media are hiding from them. I mean, it's really as simple as that.
Well, actually, though, I mean, what we probably have, I mean, I'm under the impression that the language of the United States, the official language is English. And therefore, the word journalist has a meaning, and journalism has a meaning. And they, thank you for that comment. But the idea is that just declaring you're a journalist, I mean, I just wonder how many of these people, if somebody just declared they were a doctor and that they had a right to operate on them, or a surgeon, would that be okay?
Well, again, the short answer to that is that, again, doctors, lawyers, architects, I mean, they're licensed by the state. Hairdressers are licensed by the state. Journalists are not. And so we could have a long discussion about this, but the quick response is that because we don't license journalists, the government doesn't license journalists, then basically anybody can call themselves a journalist, which has been one of the major obstacles to passing a federal law that would grant journalists testimonial privileges. The majority of the states have these laws. They're called shield laws in most states. Minnesota has one. New York has one of the best ones. I mean, there are any number of states that have them, but we've not been able to get a federal law through Congress. And there are reasons that that's been blockaded along the way, but one of the main ones has been the difficulty of defining who a journalist would be.
Yeah.
Because if the government gets into the business of doing that, and we're seeing this to some extent in what's happening with the Trump administration now in terms of who it grants press passes and credentials to, they're going to decide who gets to be a journalist based on whether they're ideologically aligned with the administration or not.
Okay, well, that just pretty well describes the chaos that we now still call the United States of America. But the other question is, as far as the Minneapolis law enforcement, the city's law enforcement, especially with federal troops being readied, it's their cold weather Arctic response forces that are being readied for that. That's a little absurd in itself, but what is their policy on dealing with them? Let's say an ICE agent, for instance, does something that is against the law, against a citizen of a resident of Minneapolis. It's against Minneapolis law or Minnesota law. What is their policy on dealing with these people?
Yeah, let me throw also into this, Jane, the question of the mobilization of the National Guard by Governor.
Right, by Governor Walz. Yeah, I had a mixed reaction when I heard that Walz was doing that, because I did think, so you're going to call out the National Guard, and we're going to have ICE here, and then we're going to have the Airborne Division, and are we basically just going to have a shooting war in the middle of Minnesota? I mean, it's a scary prospect. But to answer your specific question, the position that Chief O'Hara of the Minneapolis Police Department has taken is that if you are being assaulted by anybody, including ICE, you should call 911. Now, the degree to which Minneapolis law enforcement would, interact with ICE, to some extent, kind of remains to be seen. But in these instances where, and we've had a number of them, as we've talked about, where they've been harassing people that they have no jurisdiction over. Because remember, ICE doesn't have authority, to be traffic cops, for example. They have no authority to do that. Their authority is to find and take into custody people that are in violation of the immigration laws. That's it. They're not supposed to be doing anything else. So to the extent that they're interfering, for example, with a protester, for instance, the law enforcement here would have authority to intervene. I mean, now it could get messy, obviously, but Chief O'Hara has said, you call 911, and I guess we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, that certainly is. If ICE has no authority, then the shooting of Renee Good was, to put it mildly, exceeding their authority, or the harassment of her.
Yeah, I mean, again, the question, and obviously this will play out in due course, I suppose, if there's ever any investigation, they would say, our operation in terms of trying to apprehend people that are here without documentation was being interfered with by her, and that meant that we had the authority to take action against her. But as many people have pointed out, there were many ways to de-escalate that situation that would not have involved that degree of force. She had a car that had a license plate number on it. They could easily have taken that down, tracked her down, and arrested her if they had a basis on which to charge her. Because unlike ICE that keeps switching its license plates, there's no evidence that Renee Good was doing that with her car.
Right. Okay. Well, let me give other people a chance to ask questions.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you, Michael. Before I go to turn to Lily, I just want to throw in issues that have to do with this influencer issue that Michael raised. I would argue that you have a whole bunch of factors that we've been dealing with now for several decades. One, the destruction of the equal time provision going back into the late 80s, which essentially laid the basis for right-wing talk radio expanding the way it is. Secondly, the promise of the internet in its early stages, which was anybody can be a journalist. anybody could report. And the whole question of citizen journalism, which is a legitimate issue to talk about, not one to poo-poo. And those of us who come from community radio, we're well aware of how it is important to empower people, the grassroots. You know, people may remember that for a while here in New York, the person who was the chair of the board here in the station in New York at WBAI Radio, she was the sort of earth mother of cable access TV in the United States, Dee Dee Halleck. So, there's a lot of that throughout the whole country. And I personally am in favor of empowering the average person to report. But the question that is, I think, always there, and I get that when you go to, events at Columbia Journalism School, is what is a journalist? Who is a journalist? What does it mean to be a journalist? And those are very good questions, Mike. Lily, go on, Lily.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Kirtley, for being very generous with your time this evening. I also have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one that I thought that I've been wondering a lot about, and perhaps you're the right person to ask, being that you're both a lawyer and concern yourself with media ethics. It's the use of the word murder versus over being killed. I've seen that be discussed a lot, and I was wondering if you had an opinion, both kind of legally and from an ethical perspective, on how that would, what the appropriate word would be for someone like that, for that situation with Renee Nicole Good. And the second question that I had was, I had seen a case where he's only kind of identified by his first name, I believe. It's Mushbashir. He's an American citizen. He's of Somalian origin, and he was also kind of tackled by ICE. And I was wondering, I've now seen people talking about American citizens who are walking around with all their documents or copies of their documents because they're concerned because they're of a visible minority that might attract ICE. And I want to know if that was becoming a factor and what some of the legality of that was.
Well, I'll answer that question first. I'm saying that I think we are certainly seeing, and I'm speaking in the population I'm most familiar with, which is students at the University of Minnesota. We have many international students who are here legally. We have first and second generation students who are of Somali heritage and Hispanic heritage and so forth. And I can tell you that they are carrying their papers with them now. I think the point that I would make is that I don't know that ICE has any authority to demand that people produce their papers, but it is probably a prudent thing to do because we've had a number of instances here where ICE has grabbed somebody, they've shown them their real ID or whatever, and then they let them go, which of course, the confrontation should never have happened in the first place. But the question is, do you do what you need to do or not? We did have one instance here of someone who said, I was born here, I am not showing you my papers. And she was taken into custody for about 8 hours and then released. So, I mean, this is, I think, a decision that everyone has to make for themselves in terms of what they're comfortable with and what they're willing to do, whether they want to engage in, it's not civil disobedience, obviously, not to show your papers, but the question is, do you want to cool your heels at the Whipple Building detention center, or do you want to go home to your kids? So it's appalling, and I'm not trying to make light of it by any means. I'm just saying that sometimes a pragmatic approach may be the best solution in this really kind of lawless situation. Murder has very specific definitions. I'm not an expert in federal law, but I can tell you that in Minnesota, we have 3 degrees of murder, and they involve everything from premeditated killings or killing that is associated with a felony like a bank robbery. We've got intentional killing without premeditation, and then we've got dangerous or reckless indifference to life, but without intent to kill, which nevertheless results in somebody's death. I mean, that's just kind of the textbook definition, and I'm kind of truncating it a little bit, but just to give you a general sense. Back when I was in journalism school and as I teach students, I think it's always tricky to label a particular act as being a certain type of crime. Even if somebody is going to go forward with bringing charges against someone, that you don't know what the prosecutor is going to choose, whether they're going to pick murder or they're going to choose manslaughter or something like that. So I think using terms like murder until it has been adjudicated in a court as murder, or at least there's been a formal charge filed, is probably not the most ethical thing to do. I always tell my students that they need to keep in mind that, and I'm not speaking of ICE specifically here, I'm talking about law enforcement in general sense. If there's been an unlawful killing, one of the first things that law enforcement wants to do is do what? To reassure the public that there's no further risk to the public, and to assure the public that they have found the perpetrator, whether in fact they have or not. And so they'll throw around words like that. And it's not that a journalist can't legally use that terminology. Under libel law, for example, if you're accurately reporting what law enforcement says, you can't be sued for libel, even if it ultimately turns out that it wasn't true. But I think it's important to remember that law enforcement usually holds most of the cards in these situations. And I think it's important for journalists to not just take the bait and accept that as a truthful statement. So that's a long answer to your question, but I guess I would say I'm cautious about using legal terms of art like murder until there's at least been a charge filed. And I think up until then, it's just a matter of using words like shot and killed, things like that. That would be my preferred terminology.
You got more, Lily?
The last question that I wondered is, and this is kind of more of a general question, but if Waltz had never run for VP, do you think that ICE would be the target here in Minnesota now, or do you think Minnesota is being punished because of his VP run and the fact that he kind of gained national attention?
I have no doubt that having the temerity to run as the running mate for Kamala Harris did kind of put a target on Waltz's back as far as the Trump administration was concerned. But as Jim mentioned, there's been animosity towards our politicians for some time. Ilhan Omar is the obvious example, but Senator Amy Klobuchar is somebody that Trump doesn't like either. So, then there's people like Tom Emmer, Republican, who, is a huge Trump supporter and, never met a Trump policy he didn't like. So, it's not as simple as to say, we're all Democrats here or something like that, because we're not. And there are some high profile Republicans in this state. And I think, they are Trump supporters, and that is, I think is duly noted. But the fact is, this state has never voted a majority for President Trump. He doesn't like us, and he certainly doesn't like Tim Walz. So I don't know if he had chosen not to run, would it have been as obvious a problem? I don't know, but I honestly think that the narrative was an irresistible one. The scandal that is pointing at the Somali community just was so appealing to the Trump anti-immigrant narrative that, and the fact that we have so many of our politicians who are Democrats, just made it irresistible.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just before I get to one, the idea that there's 90,000 Somalis who vote as a bloc for the Democrats. And then, of course, the other question comes in of the Shirley impact on Waltz. I mean, was there actually, could you see a polling data shift with that? And Emmer, I believe, he's the Republican running for governor. Is that correct? So how do you stand vis-a-vis Waltz politically in the polling in Minnesota?
Well, actually, Tom Emmer's the majority whip in the House of Representatives. He's a very high profile, well, at least in this state, we think he's high profile Republican, and is a huge Trump supporter. Again, I truly think the Nick Shirley thing was sort of the final catalyst, but my own sense was that Waltz was kind of reading the writing on the wall that he was not really going to be a viable candidate, and the thought that this would sort of be a repeat of what happened in the presidential election, I think, had to be daunting to him, to think that he might not, it would be a great humiliation if he had not won. So I think that was certainly a factor, and whether it was specifically the Shirley thing or not, I think the outcome was kind of inevitable.
Right. It always shows you how negative campaigning works. Go on, Juan. You have to unmute Juan. Juan. Gotta unmute Juan. All right, while you're doing that, Michael, just unmute and I'll, as soon as Juan unmutes, I'll bring him in. Go on, Mike.
Okay, well, yeah, it sounds like what's going on here is obviously we know there's been a breakdown of law, breakdown in the use of law, and we've seen that with the tariffs. We know that Trump is doing most of this, if not all of it, from just political personal bias, and that yeah, and it's almost like letting giving a 3-year-old unlimited power. But I want to get to, besides my own commentary there, the idea of racial profiling, and because obviously this is what ICE is doing, and I wanted to know, as far as the law goes in Minnesota, as far as racial profiling, and also if somebody, their police or any type of law enforcement could be charged with illegal arrest. In other words, an illegitimate arrest, and they can be sued. So can ICE be sued for any of this? So that's a separate thing.
Hold that a moment there, Michael. Go on, Juan. What are you gonna say, Juan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. Yes, I think that I've heard that the background of the ICE men, to call them that, is something to take into consideration, because it looks like they've appeared out of nowhere. There's a small army virtually. People have compared their formation to that of the Gestapo. They have asked, whether the men that compose it were coming out of the Proud Boys, for instance, or if any of them participated in the January 6th rebellion in Washington a few years ago. It seems like it's very important question to ask, and who these people are, who they're actually being mobilized for. I've heard that the man was responsible, the ICE agent that was responsible for the death of that woman, had a background of similar incidents in his history. So, it seems like it's necessary to find out who these people are and who they work for, because they've appeared out of nowhere, and they've become like a small army. So that's my basic question.
Well,
Yeah,
I certainly agree with what you were saying. I think maybe it's because I live in Minnesota. I've only had the pleasure of seeing the ICE recruiting films when I've traveled to other states, because they don't seem to air them here. I can't imagine why that would be. But I understand that essentially they are, very much predicated on the idea of encouraging people, anybody who's got a gun, get $50,000 signing bonus, come and defend the homeland, all this rhetoric that is evocative of the Nazi era. And you're absolutely right. We don't know who these people are, and we know that money keeps getting poured into ICE recruitment and hiring, and just the sheer number of individuals that they have added to their ranks would suggest that they're not being vetted or trained. And Trump didn't invent ICE. It's been around for years and was used in prior administrations. But although there's certainly been questions about excesses, the degree of what's been happening now, and I went to law school in Tennessee, so I don't want to say that everybody from the South is terrible or anything like that, but it does appear that a number of the ICE agents have come from the southern part of the country. They're certainly not from the upper Midwest, although Jonathan Ross was living in Minneapolis, so who knows. But the point is, we don't know who these people are. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know what training they've had. And I think the whole thing is a really appalling lack of transparency. Plus, they wear masks. I mean, that's the other piece of it. They are this ragtag band with no clear uniform or anything that they're wearing. Usually, they have no identification as to who they are. I mean, their own name or a badge number, even, or anything like that. Some of them say police, some of them say ICE. They're certainly not Minneapolis or St. Paul police. And this whole lack of transparency is really appalling because, as several people have commented, and I think it's kind of worth reminding everybody of this. I realize that the assassination of our emeritus Speaker of our House here, Melissa Hortman, and her husband, seems like ancient history now. And I'm not saying it was a Trump-inspired event, but remember that the guy who went to shoot her and her husband and the other representatives was disguised as a police officer. And my point is to say that with these ICE people, how do you know who they are? You know, what way do you have to verify that they have any authority? I mean, whether you agree with ICE's mission or not, they have certain legal authority. Except how do you even know that these guys are who they say to be? And as in so many other cities, I mean, we've had our share of, carjackings here. If some strange guys come up to your car and try to open the door, how do you know they're ICE? How do you know they're not a carjacker? So, this is a really appalling situation, I think, and it goes kind of beyond classic police brutality to the idea that you really have no idea who these people are and what authority they might have. To answer the question about racial profiling, it's interesting that you would mention that because the Minnesota ACLU has just actually within the last couple of days filed a lawsuit seeking a class action in our federal court here in Minnesota against ICE on behalf of three people who say they've been racially profiled in recent weeks. So at least based on federal civil rights laws and others, there is certainly, I think, authority to bring that kind of challenge. But what the outcome will be, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I created in 2003 as a result of the Homeland Security Act. And what's amazing is the increase in the budget because you look at their own propaganda. They're calculating on their website that they are spending $8 billion a year. Now we know the amount of money that's being spent is way, way, way beyond that. And in some cases, it's equivalent to the defense budgets of most countries in the world, over the defense budget of most countries in the world. And I just, want to point that out. Juan, you have some other comments or questions?
Yes, one of the things that strikes one about the ICE people is that they come in like commandos. They're over heavily armed, you know, and they look more like an invasion force than they do a police force.
They
And I'm
do.
sure that that's intentional.
I have no
And
doubt of that. I mean, it's funny in a way because I mean, as I said, they wear camo gear and masks and helmets and things like that. And of course, with our extremely cold weather we're having right now, they're so bundled up. Somebody said they look like the Michelin Man, and they do. But they have these helmets on. I mean, it's like you're in Star Wars or something, and it's absolutely. I'm sure that Christy Noem would say they're just trying to, provide themselves with protection from the horrible people that live in the Twin Cities. But there's no question in my mind that it's designed to intimidate and create fear. That's what it's all
well,
about.
they're supposedly a police force in the end, but it looks like they've actually been invaded. They've been equipped to be a military force, and I think that's something that needs to be investigated. If you think about the police forces in the past, they usually dress like normal people, or they have a uniform that is very low key. But these people are dressed to give the impression that they're paratroopers that have dropped in to take over the place. And I don't think that's something that's an off matter. I think that that's something intentional. And I think it's necessary to go look deeply behind the mentality that created that, because they could just as well easily become the basis for a coup d'etat.
Well,
I think that
Helped you?
I agree. I mean, people have used the term brown shirts and Gestapo and things like that, and that gets a certain reaction. But I would just say that again, while I absolutely deplore everything that you have discussed here, I think it's important to remember that even kind of ordinary police have become drastically militarized in the last 15, 20 years or so. I mean, what kind of equipment do they get? They get military surplus stuff. I mean, they really have, to a great extent, transformed our civilian police force into some kind of a paramilitary operation, at least in terms of the toys they have and the mindset they have. And that's actually part of what in the civil rights action that was brought here after George Floyd, that was part of what came out, that this had become sort of a mindset that was much more oriented not towards, protecting the public, but rather towards treating the public as enemies. I'm not saying that ICE is not bad. It is so, but I wonder how much law enforcement overall has been affected by this mindset. Jim mentioned 9/11 and the shifts and changes that have happened in law enforcement since then, and I think we're still dealing with that.
Well, I
You
just,
know, there's another.
well, yeah, go on. So, go on.
One last thing.
Yeah, go
One
on.
last thing. Um, it's been said repeatedly that police forces now in the United States are trained in Israel. And given the role of IPAC with the government, that needs to be investigated, because obviously the tactics that the people have against U.S. citizens are completely compatible to that of the Israelis with the Palestinians, and that needs to be addressed. That needs to be challenged, because that's really the core issue of how they're being militarized. I don't even think military act that way. These people are definitely treating people in the United States like the Israelis treat the Palestinians. That needs to be challenged.
All right. Well, thank you, Juan. And I just wanted here is the website of the ACLU in Minnesota. I just put that up in the screen. And then the issue of the militarization of the police forces, this has been going on since the 60s. There's been nonstop evolution of this since the 1960s. And this did come up at a time of George Floyd when everybody was like, oh my God, they discovered that we actually have legislation to turn over military equipment. So remember, as we were expanding after 2003, they were giving what they felt were obsolete MRAPs and other vehicles to the police departments as part of their crime acts. Clinton actually started this with his legislation when he was president. So this has been going on ever since the late 1960s. I mean, there's lots of documentation, but thank you, Juan. I intended to. There's a guy who actually has written some very good books about that, and he's on my target list. Michael, go on, Michael. And does anybody else besides Michael want to talk? Go on, Mike.
Okay, well, I'd like to. I mean, I have to say that I think it's actually what they're being trained, if they're trained by the Israelis, what they're doing, they're using Israeli tactics in the quote unquote occupied territories, and but the ICE in particular is using this within the actual boundaries of the country, which is even worse. But the idea of, and they're now using it on citizens, not just people who are not official citizens. But anyway, I have a hypothetical, and unfortunately, it may not be a hypothetical for long. If a legally armed, in other words, someone who has a permit to carry a handgun, is assaulted by ICE who has not identified themselves, who wear no identifications, and we know the type of clothing they wear can be purchased by non law enforcement personnel. If somebody is assaulted and they shoot in self-defense, at least in Minnesota, which would that mean that would that be a defense in their part because they were being assaulted by somebody who did not identify themselves as law enforcement?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a criminal lawyer, and I don't know exactly how that would play out. I mean, we are not a stand your ground state, but we are a state that does allow concealed carry. So I think, like anything else, it would depend upon the totality of the circumstances. You know, we've heard a lot of rhetoric from the Trump administration, from Vance and others about how everything ICE does, you know, they're immune. That's not true. It simply is not true. So I think the question would be, were they acting reasonably under the circumstances? And was the individual who pulled out a gun and shot them acting reasonably under the circumstances? I wish I could give you an answer that was certain, but it's like when people have asked me about, you know, how many feet are you allowed to be away from ICE, or how close can you get? And the answer is it depends upon the circumstances. So sorry, I can't answer that question. I am afraid, as you said, it's a hypothetical now. It probably will become a test case at some
Okay, cut
point.
it off.
Absolutely, and we will see that happening. And Gail, go on, Gail. You want to ask?
Just a very brief question for
Oh,
Jane.
goodness.
You said maybe 20 minutes ago. I haven't been following this closely enough, I guess, because I had never heard that Jonathan Ross was living in Minneapolis.
Yeah,
I mean, being a researcher at heart, I guess, I wonder, did he even know who Renee Good was? Was she kind of a well-known group of these people running around with whistles and, you know, the higher calling of stopping ICE? Was she at the top of some list? Could he have known it?
You know, anything, of course, is possible, but I have not heard anybody say that she was a high profile, you know, individual, well known in these circles. I mean, there are thousands of people in the Twin Cities that are involved in these kinds of activities, and there are a number of them that, you know, have got a presence and are the ones who they put on the Sunday morning talk shows and so forth. I had never heard of her, and I just, so I can't say it's not possible, but I don't think so.
Well, has he lived there a long time?
I
Could
don't
he
know.
have some axe to grind is what
No,
I'm
no,
asking.
no. He has lived there for a while. He owns a house. He has a family.
He
Well, that's
does.
really something to say. That puts a different light on it, doesn't it? A
Well,
little bit, maybe. I
well,
mean,
we'll
he
see.
had an axe to grind.
Well, go on, Jane.
Well,
Maybe.
I mean, I really don't know. I
All right.
don't know that. I mean, he's been here, you know, for a while. But again, you know, I don't know. I mean, he's an Iraq War veteran. I don't know what his whole history is. He actually joined the U.S. Border Patrol in Texas at one point. I mean, he has not lived here forever. But his home is in an area outside of Minneapolis called Chaska, which is, you know, kind of a greater suburban area. Again, I don't know.
Yeah,
Do you know offhand, not to drag this out, but do you know offhand if related to Juan's question, who are these guys, which is kind of a nice thought about ICE, or not nice, but pointed. Is much of the ICE contingency actually local or from, let's say, the northern Midwest? Or, I mean, do we know at all where they are from? Just southern, you said, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean,
generally.
I think he's been here. I was just looking this up, and because I really didn't remember. I think he's been here for about 10 years.
Yeah.
But you know, I think that it's, again, we've had this surge of personnel that's been brought in from other parts of the country. There's no question about that. Just listening to their accents, we know that they're not from Minnesota. They're not from the upper Midwest. And I think many of them have come from Texas, I would say in all likelihood, as Ross did 10 years ago.
Gee, do you have to confirm every stereotype I have?
Well, let me just though make the point, because Jim raised this too. I mean, the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, Duluth, these are great hubs of, liberalism and the remnants of the old Democrat Farmer Labor Party. But we've got a big chunk of the state in terms of physical space, not in terms of numbers of people, that is quite conservative. And they, one of the people that was interviewed yesterday during the Jack Lang demonstration came down from, I think, the Detroit Lakes area, which is the northern part of the state. And, expressing extremely Trumpian views about immigration, about the First Amendment, so forth. My point is, there are people that they could easily recruit here in the state to work for ICE, without doubt, in my mind.
Yeah, it raises a very interesting question. We don't know the demographic statistics of ICE. I'm thinking about, my knowledge of the Black and Tans when they're recruited to fight in Ireland after World War One and to put down the IRA. And it's an interesting question. Tario, the former head of the Proud Boys, is supposedly an ICE agent, which I want to verify before I make that assertion. But Lily, why don't we bring Lily on, and anybody else have one more question? Because I know we could keep Jane here quite a long time, and she's been very generous in the past 2 days to spend time with us. Lily, go on, Lily.
Yeah, I was just thinking listening to Professor Kirtley talk, that I was wondering about, you had mentioned the immunity of, people talking like J.D. Vance and talking about how they're completely immune. I don't think there's going to be any political will, certainly from this administration, to hold these ICE agents accountable. But I was wondering if there was any recourse civilly to handle any of this, and whether that ultimately becomes, I think of like how O.J. Simpson's victims' families found justice civilly. So I wonder if there would be some sort of possibility for something like that to happen. And just your thoughts on that. I know you said you're not a criminal lawyer, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I believe that just like somebody like Derek Chauvin, was criminally prosecuted, but he also could be subject to a civil lawsuit. I am not aware that there is blanket immunity for ICE or Customs and Border Protection agents or anybody else from those kinds of civil actions. But again, it's all going to turn on whether they were acting within the scope of their mandated duties, whether they acted reasonably, all those kinds of questions. And, I mean, there's already been discussion, although how serious it will be, I guess, will remain to be seen. But as I said, Renee's good widow has already got a lawyer that is going to represent her, which presumably means that there's going to be some kind of action brought, if not against Jonathan Ross personally, against ICE under the Federal Tort Claims Act or something like that, or under Minnesota's own state laws. But I think it's still early days for that. So I think we'll have to wait and see. What I am afraid we will not see is any kind of accountability brought by an investigation within the Department of Justice. I mean, they've ruled that out, so I wouldn't count on any relief there.
Go on, Frank. I think you want to ask something, Frank, before we close out. Frank, did you unmute?
Yeah, okay. I just want to point out, as a matter of interest, that the projected salary budget for ICE is probably around $30 billion for 2026.
30 billion.
And that's 30 billion, yeah. And that's more than, or about equal to, Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, which is quite amazing. And it's also equivalent to the personnel and salaries budget for Ukraine. So these are tough guys, presumably. So, it would help the Ukrainians a lot if the whole lot was sent over there. That's my opinion. But I don't think it helps anybody. That's my input.
Okay. Michael, you have the last comment. Go on, Michael.
Well, I remember during the George Floyd fiasco, there were calls for defunding the police, but a more middle ground were calls for retraining the police. Now, we all have I have my doubts, about the training of ICE. It's the same thing as training of a soldier. You don't train a soldier well, he doesn't behave well in the field. So have there been calls for a retraining of ICE, even though Minnesota has no jurisdiction over it. Is there a move to say that for a call for an examination of the training of ICE and to retrain them? Is there a movement building for that?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a Minnesota specific movement in that regard. I should say, and I should have mentioned this, that there has been an attempt on the part of Mary Moriarty, the state prosecutor here, to create, a portal to gather video and other information with the idea that eventually there might be some kind of legal action that could be brought against ICE or this particular individual. I mentioned the issue of going beyond the scope of authority and so forth. The problem is the supremacy clause and whether the argument would be that that conflicts with federal law. But anyway, to answer your question, I haven't heard people saying that. I think, to paraphrase what our mayor said, I think we just want ICE to get out of Minnesota. And I think it would be great for there to be a call. I mean, in another time with a Congress that was less supine, I cannot believe that there would not be calls for exactly the kinds of things that you've been talking about, investigating who's training ICE, where this money is coming from, where these trainers are coming from. Those are all really important questions. I mean, my guess is, and I haven't studied this, that I suspect there's a private sector part of that's involved in this training, probably with connections to some members of Congress, for all we know. I mean, it is layers and layers and layers of who is doing this, but there should be, in my opinion, a congressional investigation of who these people are, who's training them, what their authority is. But we're just endlessly told that money has to be given to them and it's to protect us all, and we aren't allowed to ask anything about it. So I wish that people in other parts of the country, because at least our senatorial delegation is all Democrats. We have a mix in terms of our congressional delegation, but they can't do it alone. And it would be really great to see support from other states' delegations demanding this kind of investigation.
Well, maybe if there are enough lawsuits, it'll give them some pause. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And of course I throw this little poster up because we know the one big beautiful bill was where this increase came, and a 300% increase in their budget. And of course the cuts, we're all aware of these issues, SNAP being cut, Medicare, Medicaid, with actually what I think tens of billions of dollars being cut out of these programs. Just to point that out. And it's really interesting to hear some of these comments today because it is an interesting question to investigate. And some of us have the ability to do this. So it might be something to think about concentrating on. Well, on that note, Jane, I want to thank you so much. It was really terrific to talk to you for these past 2 days. Let's do it again very soon.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it too. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more definitive answers on some of these things, but
Well,
as is often the case with the law, it's going to evolve, and we're just going to have to see how it plays out.
yeah, exactly. And, it's a moving situation. And, if you have colleagues in Minneapolis and Minnesota, and, we'd love to return back to you because you have a particular lens here that's very valuable in the sense that you have the experience of media in general, because we didn't get into the questions of, the pictures being presented and how that frames everything, how people perceive these pictures of everything. Because I look at the Fox News site and it's quite interesting. They always will show these pictures of chaos, these pictures of, and then they'll emphasize, I'm not going to defend somebody who decides to kill a Ukrainian immigrant in the Charlotte subway system. Who the hell is going to defend that sort of stuff? But it becomes like one thing after the next, and propaganda basically. And it's very important to have someone with your eye to be able to share that with us. And we thank you so much for joining us today. It was really terrific.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Okay. Good night. Take it
Good
easy.
night.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks.